Prompts me to ask you a question, actually, and this may be a silly question, but feel free to answer it in whatever way you'd like. But I often think about this in terms of just artists, and how aware are you of your own artistic evolution? And do you find that your own artistic evolution is somehow guided by things outside of yourself? You know, just for example, technological advancements, or are you more interested in just being true to your own nature of being, for want of a better term?
Well, again, to me, it's a paradoxical balance equation. So I think the way I look at it, I'm on a journey wandering through life. And I had a previous architectural monograph called Wandering the Garden of Technology and Passion. And I see it a bit as wandering. And I think some architects want to be on a very linear course. And that works for somebody like Richard Meyer, let's say. Where he's got a specific style, he works in that style, he's refining that style, and ironically, he's not the best designer in the style that he established, oftentimes. A lot of times, some of the buildings that people love of his were designed by other people in the office working in his style under his guidance. But I've always been intrigued by the idea that the world is a feast, and there's a lot of things to love. The downside is, if you're too broad, you never focus and you never refine. So the trick is to be open and yet be on a path, but yet let the path wander, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's kind of the view I take on it. I want to be open and have the opportunity for change and growth to occur. But at the same time, there are fundamental things. You know, when you look at the watercolors, there's a consistency to them, even though they were done over a wide span of time. An underlying consistency, even though, you know, they might be different subject matters. The same is true of the poetry. The architecture changes a bit more than that, but there's still an underlying, because the problem with architecture is it's all done by commission. So sometimes the client wants a very boxy, efficient, inexpensive building, and you have to try to give it humanity and life. So I'm a great lover of designing with curves, but sometimes your building project can't afford it. Like, there's no curves in my house. I can't afford it.
Yeah. So for my final question was, what do you think of labels, in the sense that, for example, when I look at what you do, you're an architect, but you're also, writing poetry or, painting and stuff like that. So that makes me think of you more in terms of a multidisciplinary artist. I don't know whether you would agree with that.
Yes, no, I would agree with that. And I think the thing is, within architecture, in the old days, this would have been, 50 years ago and before, I think architects saw themselves as artists, and they actually functioned as artists. They used to write more poetry. They used to, do more painting, sculpture, and different things like that. And they saw themselves as a part of a spectrum of the arts. And I think after World War II, this shifted, and architects became almost more like facilitators and engineers. And I think, labels are helpful in trying to get people to understand what you're doing and what you're about. But as a label can aid you in people saying, oh, well, this person is a such and such, that's what they do. It can also hinder you that, you become blocked into this thing and you sort of can't change. The reality is, sometimes you have to break out of that. But I know, there are musicians that get labeled as doing the old work was the great work, and why are they doing this new work? And we've got a good friend, Mark Kozelick, who's an independent musician, and everybody loves his old work, and he's frustrated in a sense that, why don't they love the new work? Because he's moved on. And I think, you have to decide what your art is about, and whether you want to embrace going back to what resonated with people because maybe your underlying message was more important than your personal stylistic desire to change, or is what you're doing important and people just need to catch up. And, each artist has to wrestle with that dynamic. and it's true in architecture as well as painting as well as poetry. So your underlying motivation is tricky. For me, for the watercolors and for the poetry, they are definitely responsive to the times, the moment where I'm writing or painting. But fortunately for me, they're free of commercial needs. So I don't need to try to make a living painting or writing poetry, which frees me up to follow more, wander down that path more. Architecture is a little different story. There you get into the issues of branding and business and how are you perceived in the marketplace and, how much clarity do people want on, Form 4, John Marx, this is what they do. This is what you would expect to get. And of course, it's the same dynamic as if you define yourself too rigidly, then people will only hire you for that.